The candles in the long gallery had been lit 2 hours early, and the whole court had been told why. A duke meant to claim his bride before the Lord Chamberlain and 400 witnesses, and the bride had been chosen, dressed, and delivered to the threshold like a parcel that knew its own address. She stood at the head of the room in borrowed silver, her gloved hands folded, her chin level, and she watched the man cross the polished floor toward her with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never in his life been told no. He stopped an arm's length away. He held out his hand. The room held its breath as one body, and into that held breath, Lilias Tregowan did the one thing no one in the gallery had thought possible. She did not take it. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room surprised. It was the silence of a room that did not yet understand what it had seen, the way a struck bell holds a single instant before the note arrives. Maxon, the Duke of Herrenwood, stood with his hand still extended over the empty space between them. And for the first time in the memory of anyone present, the practiced ease drained out of his face and left something underneath it that the candles found unflattering. Lilias did not move. She had rehearsed this stillness for 11 nights alone, in a cold room, and now she spent it. She would tell them why. She had come to tell them why. What she had carried into that gallery folded small against her ribs beneath the cold silk was the reason, and she meant to set it down where every last one of them could see it. The telling, though, would take the whole of the night to earn, and to understand the weight of it, you would have to go back. Stay with her a moment. You will want to have seen the beginning before you watch the end. 3 years before that gallery, the Tregowans had not been poor. Lilias had grown up at Thrushcombe, a low gray house at the bend of a Devon river, where her father kept 100 acres of orchard and a name that the county trusted. She had learned her letters at his elbow, and her music from a tutor who came twice a week from the town. And she had believed in the unexamined way of the young and the loved, that the shape of her life was settled and kind. Her mother had died when Lilias was 9, and her father had not married again. And so the house had been the two of them and the orchards and the long, slow turning of the seasons, and it had been enough. What Lilias did not know in those years was that her father had once done a great kindness for a man who would not forgive it. Old grievances in that part of the country were quiet things. They lived in account books, and in the spaces between neighbors at church, and they waited. Her father had held a piece of land that the Herrenwood estate wanted, a strip of water meadow along the river that controlled the mill leat for half the valley. The old Duke, Maxon's father, had offered to buy it 3 times, and 3 times Mr. Tregowan had declined. Courteously and absolutely, because the meadow fed the cottagers downstream, and the cottagers were his people. When the old Duke died, his son inherited the want along with the title, and his son was not a man who declined to be declined. He simply went quiet and waited, the way the grievance had waited, and he was patient in a manner that should have frightened anyone who understood it. Lilias did not understand it. She was 17, and she was thinking of other things. The first blow fell in the spring of her 18th year, when the bank in the county town called in a loan her father had never knowingly taken. The papers were produced. They bore his signature, or a signature so like his that the clerk who examined them could not in conscience swear it false, and they bound the orchards of Thrushcombe against a debt of £4,000. Her father went white at the sight of them. He said, very quietly, that he had signed no such thing, and the clerk looked at him with the particular pity of a man who has heard that sentence before and has learned to disbelieve it. The bank gave him 6 months. He spent those 6 months riding from solicitor to solicitor, and Lilias spent them learning the true face of the place she had grown up in. Doors that had always opened to the Tregowan name now opened more slowly, then not at all. The tutor stopped coming. The county, which had trusted her father, discovered that trust was a thing it could withdraw without explanation, and it withdrew it. By autumn the orchards were gone, sold under the hammer to a buyer whose agent stood at the back of the room and never once raised his own voice, only his card. The buyer was the Duke of Herrenwood. The strip of water meadow went with the rest, and the mill leat was his, and the cottagers downstream learned what it cost to have been her father's people. Mr. Tregowan did not survive the second winter. He took a chill, walking the boundary of land that was no longer his, came home shaking, and was dead. Inside a fortnight, Lilia sat with him at the end. The last thing he said to her, his hand cold in both of hers, was that the signature on the bank's paper had not been his, and that she must not let them tell her otherwise. She promised. She was 19, and she had nothing left in the world but a promise and a name that the county now spoke of in the past tense. To the town, by then, she was simply the ruined man's girl. That was the phrase, and it traveled ahead of her into every room. It was spoken when she took the post of companion to her father's cousin, a sharp-tongued widow in Bath who fed her and clothed her plainly and reminded her each morning of the charity she was receiving. It followed her when she walked to church behind that widow, in a gown turned twice at the hem. Lilias heard it, and did not correct it, because there was no correction to be made that anyone would believe. She kept her father's promise the only way she could, which was to keep her own counsel and to keep her eyes open, and she waited, the way grievances in that country had taught her to wait. She did not waste the waiting. What she did in those years was the thing the court would not learn until the very end, and it was the thing that would make the end possible. In the long evenings in Bath, while the widow slept, Lilias wrote letters. She wrote to the clerk who had examined the false signature, and when he did not answer, she wrote to his junior, a young man named Harlock, who had left the bank under a cloud and now copied documents for a living in a back room off the Avon. She wrote to the cottagers of the valley, one by one, in a hand they could read. She asked small exact questions, and she kept every answer, and she folded the answers small and sewed them into the lining of the only thing of her mother's she had left, a plain gray traveling case with a worn brass lock. She was building something. She did not yet know what it would be for. The Duke of Heronwood, in those same years, was building too. He had the meadow and the mill and the leat, but he did not have what the strip of land was truly worth, because a parcel taken by a forged hand sits uneasily in a man's holdings. And a clever man knows it. There was a way to make the holding clean. There was a way to settle every doubt and bind the valley to him, past the power of any solicitor to unpick, and the way had a name, and the name was Lilias Tregowan. If the last of the Tregowans came to him willingly, as a bride, with her family's blessing implied in her own hand at the altar, then no court in England would ever look twice at a settlement made years before. A wife does not testify against the husband she has chosen. The forged signature would be buried under a wedding. So he sought her out. He came to Bath in the spring of her 22nd year, and the widow's drawing room, which had never received anyone of consequence, received a duke. He was, Lilias would have to admit, a handsome man, and he had taken trouble to be charming, and the widow was undone by him inside a quarter of an hour. He spoke to Lilias of her father with a warmth that turned her stomach precisely because it was so well done. He said he had always regretted the misfortunes that had befallen so old and respected a family. He said the word misfortunes the way another man might say weather, as though no hand had made it. To her cousin, the widow, he was all consideration. The bankrupt's daughter, the widow said that night, glowing, made a far better impression than I had dared hope. It was the second time Lilias had heard the phrase used to her face, and she folded it away, with the rest. The Duke courted her through that spring with a patience she recognized, because it was the same patience that had taken her father's orchards. He did not press. He let the county do his pressing for him. A duke's attention to a penniless companion was a marvel that the town could not stop discussing, and the discussion did the work of persuasion better than any speech of his could have done. What a thing, people said, for a penniless companion with no name left to her. What an undeserved deliverance. The widow began to speak of the match as settled. Lilias understood that she was being maneuvered toward a door, and that the door would close behind her, and that on the far side of it her father's name would be locked forever into the lie that had killed him. She might have refused him. Then in the drawing-room, privately, She thought about it on many nights. A private refusal, though, would have been a private thing, a girl's whim, easily explained away as nerves or pride or ingratitude, and the Duke would simply have begun again, more slowly, and the next time the door would have no handle on her side. She had learned patience from the man who had ruined her father. She would use it against him. If he wanted a public wedding to bury the truth, she would give him a public refusal to disinter it, and she would choose the ground. The ground chose itself. The Duke, sure of her now, announced that he would present her at court. It was a rare and dazzling honor for a woman of her station, and the town understood it as the seal upon the match, the thing that made it real before the eyes of the realm. He would bring her into the Queen's drawing room before the assembled court, and there, in the most public arena the kingdom possessed, he would take her hand, and the world would witness the Tregowans restored. He believed he was building a cathedral over the grave of his own crime. He had handed her the one place on earth where a refusal could not be buried. She had until the presentation to make herself ready, and she did not mean to arrive empty-handed. This is the part of the story I most want you to carry. While the Duke and the widow planned silks and feathers and the order of precedence, Lilias finished the thing she had been building for 3 years. The young man named Harlock came up from the back room off the Avon, summoned by a letter she paid for with the last of her mother's earrings, and he brought with him the bank's day book for the spring of her 18th year, copied in his own careful hand before he had been turned out for refusing to copy something else. The day book recorded, in the columns "No forger thinks to alter," that on the day her father was said to have signed the loan he had been 40 miles away at a magistrate's sitting, his attendants entered and witnessed. A man cannot be in 2 places. The signature was a lie that a calendar could prove. It was not enough by itself, and Lilias knew it. A daybook can be questioned. So she had the cottagers' letters, 11 of them, each describing the same agent who had stood at the back of the auction room raising his card and never his voice, and each naming him, because a valley remembers the face of the man who took its water. And she had, last of all, the thing she had not dared hope for. Until Harlock laid it on the table before her, the original draft of the loan paper, in the forger's own hand, with her father's signature practiced 4 times down the margin, before the man had got it close enough to use. The Duke had paid for that forgery. He had not fought to burn the rehearsal. Harlock had kept it, because he was an honest man in a dishonest trade. And he had known, the way honest men do, that a day might come when it would matter. The day was coming. Lilias sewed the draft and the daybook and the 11 letters into the lining of the gray traveling case, beneath her mother's worn brass lock, and she practiced her stillness, and she waited for the court. It was in Bath, in those last weeks, that she met the other man, and the meeting was not nothing, whatever she told herself at the time. His name was Corin Dashwell, and he had no fortune to speak of and a manner that asked for none. He was the younger son of a Devon baronet, lately come home from the sea, with a captain's half-pay and a limp. He did not explain, and he had known the valley as a boy. He had known, in fact, the water meadow because he had fished the mill leat as a child with the cottagers' sons. And when he heard in a Bath card-room that the Duke of Heronwood was to marry a Tregowan of Thrushcombe, something in his level face had gone very still. He had made it his business to be introduced. He found her at the pump-room one gray morning, where she stood a little apart from the widow with a music sheet in her hand that she was not reading. He did not flatter her. He asked her plainly whether the orchards at Thrushcombe still bore, and she looked up at him startled past her guard because no one in Bath had ever once spoken to her of the orchards as a living thing rather than a lost asset. She said that she did not know, that she had not been back. He said that he had fished the leat as a boy, and that the trout there had a particular dark gold along the flank, found nowhere else he had ever cast a line. And Lilias, to her own astonishment, felt her eyes sting. He saw it. He looked away at once, to spare her, and he spoke of the weather until she had command of herself again. That was the first thing she learned about Corin Dashwell, that he would look away to spare you, and would never once let you see that he had seen. It was a small thing. It undid her more than charm could have. They met again and again, never alone, always within the rules, because Lilias would give the town no further phrase to use against her. He brought her the third time a thing he had found in a Bath bookseller's, a slim worn volume of country songs from her own valley, and inside it, pressed flat and brown with years, a single spray of orchard blossom that some earlier reader had left there. She held it in her gloved hand, and did not trust herself to speak. He said, his voice low, that he had thought she might like to have something of home. He did not say that he had searched 4 booksellers to find a Devon book. She did not learn that for a long while. What grew between them in those weeks grew without a word that the strictest chaperone could have faulted. It lived in the half-inch by which he stood nearer than he needed to at the concert. It lived in the way her breath changed when his gloved hand steadied her elbow on the wet pump-room steps and did not linger an instant past the need. He spoke to her always as to an equal, never as to the ruined girl the town had decided she was. And she found that in his company she stood differently. Taller, as though his seeing of her had loaned her back a height the county had taken. She told him nothing of the gray traveling case. She did not dare. He told her nothing of why he had sought her out. They circled the truth like 2 people who have each been burned and have learned to test the heat of a thing before they trust it. He knew the Duke. That was the second thing. And it changed everything. Corin Dashwell had served, briefly, under a man whom Herrenwood had ruined in just the way he had ruined Mr. D. Tregowyn, a half-pay lieutenant whose small estate had been swallowed by a debt he swore he never made, and who had died of it as surely as Lilius's father had. Corin had carried that man's name in his chest for 6 years, the way Lilius carried her father's. He had come to Bath. He would tell her at the last. Not to court her, but to warn her, and he had stayed because he had found, instead of a girl to be pitied, a woman already 3 years into the quiet, patient unmaking of the very man he hated. The night before the presentation he asked to see her alone, and the widow, scenting nothing, allowed it for 10 minutes in the drawing-room, with the door ajar. He stood by the cold hearth, and he told her, in short, plain sentences, who he was and whom he had served, and why he had come. He told her that the Duke had buried one ruined family, already under a forged hand, and meant to bury hers under a wedding. He said that he could not let her walk into it blind. He said the word blind, and stopped, because he had seen her face change, and what he had taken for the dawning of fear was something else, entirely. She said, very quietly, that she was not blind. She said that she had been 3 years getting her eyes open. And then, because the door was ajar, and the time was short, and she had decided in that instant to trust him with the whole of it, she crossed to the gray traveling case where it sat by the wall, and she opened the worn brass lock, and she showed him the lining. He read the forger's draft in the firelight with his jaw set hard as carved stone. He read the daybook. He read 3 of the 11 letters before he set them down with great care, as though they might break, and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on any face since her father died, an expression that took her seriously to the very bottom of the matter. He said, his voice level, that she had built in 3 years what the law had not built in 6. He said that she should not do it alone. She told him she had always meant to do it alone, because the doing of it might cost her everything, and she would not have it cost him too. He was a younger son with a captain's half-pay and a name that, unlike hers, was still unstained, and she would not see him broken for standing beside a ruined name in the Queen's own drawing-room. She named the ugly phrase herself then with her chin level, daring him to flinch from the words the town had hung on her. He did not flinch. He said her name. He said Lilius as though it were not a phrase the town owned, but a word that belonged to her alone. The first time he had used it, and it landed in the firelit room like a hand laid flat against her sternum. Then he said that he would be in the gallery, that he would stand where she could see him, and that whatever she chose to do, she would not be doing it among strangers. He did not promise to save her. He was too honest for that, and she loved him for it before she had any right to the word. He promised only to witness. In that country she had learned to be truly witnessed was the rarest deliverance there was. She slept badly. She dressed at dawn in the silver gown the Duke had sent, and she let the widow's maid pin feathers into her hair that she did not want, and she carried, in a small reticule that matched nothing, a single folded packet from the lining of the grey case. She had chosen what to bring, not all of it. The forger's draft, the daybook's relevant page, one letter from the cottager whose mill the lead had drowned, 3 pieces. Enough to break a thing open, light enough to carry against her ribs through 400 people without a single one of them seeing the weight of it. The court, when she came into it, was everything the town had promised, and worse. The long gallery blazed, with candles lit 2 hours early. The floor had been polished until it threw the flames back doubled. 400 of the highest persons in the realm stood in their silks, and their orders and their diamonds, arranged by a precedence as old as the kingdom, and at the far end on a low dais sat the figures of the court itself, and before them stood the Lord Chamberlain with his white wand of office. The Duke of Herrenwood waited at the head of the room in a coat of midnight blue that had been cut to make other men feel poorly dressed. Beside him, where a bride's people should stand, stood the widow, who had been given the place as a reward, and who wept, already with the joy of her own elevation. Lilias was announced. She walked the length of the gallery alone between the 2 banks of the watching court, and she felt every eye upon her measure, the borrowed silver, and find it borrowed. She heard the word travel ahead of her, low, behind fans, the way it had traveled into every room of her life. The bankrupt's daughter. There it was again, spoken near enough to reach her. In the most public room in England. And she let it land, and she kept walking because she had at last brought it to the place where she meant to answer it. She found Corin's face in the crowd, at the 3rd pillar on the left, exactly where he had said he would be. He did not smile. He did not need to. He stood with his weight off the bad leg, and his eyes on her steady as a lit window across dark water, and the sight of him put steel into her spine that the silver could not. The Duke watched her come with the satisfaction of a man watching the last stone of his cathedral lowered into place. He had stage-managed the whole of it. At the appointed moment, in the appointed silence, he stepped forward onto the polished floor, and he crossed to her with that unhurried confidence, and he held out his hand for the world to see her take it. And she did not take it. The held breath of the gallery broke into a murmur, then died again, because the Duke had not yet moved, and a Duke's stillness commands a room. He stood with his hand extended into the empty air, and across his handsome face passed, very fast, the thing his charm had been built to hide, a flash of pure, cold calculation, there and gone. He had not planned for this. He recovered in an instant. He smiled, and he said, in a voice pitched to carry and to forgive, that he understood that the occasion was overwhelming, that his bride was overcome. He had given her the word. Overcome. He had told 400 people how to understand her, the way the town had always told them, and for one breath the gallery began to believe him, began to soften toward the poor, overwhelmed girl, and Lilias understood that if she let that breath complete itself, she was lost. She would be led away kindly and married quietly, and her father's name would lie forever under the wedding. She had this one breath. She spent it. She said clearly, into the whole length of the gallery, that she was not overcome. She said that she was entirely in her senses, and that she would not give the Duke her hand, and that the court should hear why before it pitied either of them. The murmur that rose then was a different animal altogether. The Lord Chamberlain took half a step forward with his white wand, uncertain whether a presentation could be permitted to become this, and the Duke turned to him with the smooth authority of rank and said that the lady was unwell and must be excused, and 2 footmen began to move along the wall. Lilias saw the trap close. He would have her removed for her own good, and her words would become the ravings of an overwrought girl, and the room would be told the kind lie and would prefer it. He had foreseen this defense from the moment she balked. He had the rank to enforce it. She had perhaps 10 seconds before the footman reached her. She did not waste them on argument. She opened the reticule that matched nothing, and she took out the folded packet, and she held it up so the candles caught the paper, and she said in the voice her father had taught her to use in church that she held in her hand the proof that the Duke of Herrenwood had forged her father's signature to a debt her father never owed. had stolen the orchards of Thrushcombe under a false hand, and had come this day to bury the theft beneath a marriage. She said that she could prove every word. She asked the court before its own face whether it would rather hear her or be made an accomplice to the burying. The footmen stopped. They stopped because 400 people had turned, as one, not toward the overwhelmed girl, but toward the man beside her. And a court that has scented a true scandal will not be cheated of it by any footman alive. The Lord Chamberlain, who served in authority older than any duke, held up his wand and said that the lady would be heard. He said it because the alternative was to be seen silencing her, and a court remembers what it is made to watch. The duke made his defense, and it was a good one, because he was clever and cornered. And clever men are never more dangerous than when cornered. He laughed easily and said that the paper was a forgery itself, got up by a bankrupt's bitter daughter to extort a settlement, and that he would not dignify it. He turned to the dais, as to old friends. He named the widow as witness to the girl's instability. He named her poverty as her motive. He did everything a guilty man of rank may do, which is a great deal, and for a moment the balance of the room swung back toward him, because rank is heavy, and 4,000 pounds of orchard is an abstraction, and a duke's word is a duke's word. Then Lilias played the thing she had built 3 years to be able to play. She said that she had not come alone in her claim, though she had come alone in her person. She named Harlock, the clerk, present in the gallery by the door, who had copied the bank's daybook before he was turned out for refusing to copy a worse thing, and who could swear that on the day her father was said to have signed, her father had been 40 miles off, at a magistrate's sitting. His attendants entered and witnessed in a book the duke could not reach to alter. A man cannot be in 2 places. She held up the daybook page. She said that the original draft of the forgery in the forger's own hand lay in her gray traveling case in Bath under a brass lock, with her father's signature practiced 4 times down the margin, and that she would lay it before any magistrate the court cared to name. She said the duke had paid for that forgery and had neglected to burn the rehearsal. The room had gone very quiet. The duke's smile had not left his face, but it had stopped meaning anything, the way a lamp goes on burning after the oil is spent. And into that quiet at the 3rd pillar on the left, Corin Dashwell stepped forward off his bad leg into the open floor of the Queen's drawing room, in front of the whole court, and named himself. He said his name, and his rank, and the name of his ship, and then he named the half-pay lieutenant whom the Duke of Herrenwood had ruined 6 years before by exactly the same forged hand. A man Corin had served under and buried. He said it level and short, the way he said everything, a captain making a report he had carried 6 years to deliver. He said that he had come to Bath to warn this lady against the Duke, and had found instead that she had already proven what the law had failed for 6 years to prove, and that he would stand surety for every word she had spoken and would repeat it under oath to any magistrate in England. He did not make a speech, he crossed the floor, and he named a name, and he claimed her cause as his own before 400 witnesses, and that was all, and it was enough. A duke may laugh away a penniless girl. He cannot so easily laugh away a captain of unstained name who has nothing to gain and his career to lose by speaking, who has crossed an open floor in front of the court to stand at her side. The room understood the cost of what Corin had done by the very plainness with which he did it. The balance which rank had swung back toward the Duke swung now and did not swing again. The Duke of Herrenwood, cornered past the reach of charm, made his last defense, and it was the defense that finished him. He demanded that the captain be removed for slander and the woman for madness, and he turned to the Lord Chamberlain and to the dais and required as his right that the court take his word over theirs. He required it too loudly. He had governed himself for an hour, and the hour had run out, and the gallery heard, under the polished voice, the bare, ugly grasp of a man, insisting on being believed because he could not bear to be examined. The widow, who had wept with joy an hour before, had stopped weeping, and had gone the color of ash, because even she had heard it. The Lord Chamberlain looked at the Duke for a long moment, and said quite gently that the court could not in honor refuse to let the lady's papers be laid before a magistrate, and that until they were, the presentation was at an end. It was not a thunderbolt. It was worse than a thunderbolt for a man like the Duke. It was the withdrawal of the court's countenance, delivered without heat, the slow turning away of 400 faces that had a moment before been arranged to adore him. No one shouted at him. No one had to. The order he had ruled by his whole life had looked at him, and had found a question it could not unask, and a man whose entire power was the room's belief in him stood in a room that had stopped believing. He had built his cathedral over a grave, and the grave had opened in the floor beneath the altar, and the congregation had simply, quietly, stepped back from the edge. He did not rage further. That was the strange mercy of it, and Lilias would think of it long after. He gathered the rags of his composure, and he bowed stiffly to the dais and not to her, and he walked the lengths of the gallery between the two banks of the silent court and out, alone, and the doors closed behind him on the sound of 400 people beginning, very softly, to talk. He was not destroyed. He was examined and exposed and turned away from. And that, in that country, was a heavier sentence than ruin. The magistrate's inquiry, when it came, would take the orchards back from him and give them, after long months, to the only Tregowan left. The orchards, however, were the smaller thing. The larger thing had already happened in the gallery, in front of everyone, and could never be unhappened. He had been seen. Lilia stood where she had stood the whole time, in the Duke's silver gown, the folded packet still in her gloved hand, and she found that her knees had begun, only now, to shake. 3 years of waiting had ended in 5 minutes, and the ending had taken everything out of her at once. The Lord Chamberlain came and spoke to her with a courtesy that the room had not shown her when she entered, and asked, almost kindly, whether she was equal to remaining, and she said that she was, because she would not be carried from that floor on any arm but her own. Across the gallery, Corin Dashwell stood where he had stepped, watching her, not coming nearer, giving her the floor she had earned. He understood, better than anyone in the room, that this was her victory, and that she must be allowed to stand in it alone, first. Only when she had stood in it, only when her name had been spoken aloud as a wronged woman, and not a ruined one, did he cross to her and offer not a duke's claiming hand, but the plain steadying support of his arm, and ask, his voice low, whether she would let him take her out of the heat of the room. She put her gloved hand on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him on purpose. She felt the steadiness of him through the cloth, and she let it hold her up, and she walked out of the long gallery, not as a parcel delivered, but as a woman who had, at the last and in the most public room in England, told the truth and been believed. They were married in the spring, at the low grey church above Thrushcombe, with the orchards behind them, coming into blossom on land that was hers again. There was no court and no precedence and no borrowed silver. The cottagers of the valley came, all 11 of the letter writers and many more besides, because a valley remembers the woman who proved who had taken its water, and they filled the small church, passed its proper number and stood along the walls. The widow did not come. She had written stiffly that she was unwell, and Lilias had read the letter without anger, because she had learned that some people cannot bear to have been wrong in public, and that the unbearing of it is its own quiet punishment, and that she need add nothing to it. Harlock came and stood near the back, and Lilias saw to it that he was thanked before the whole congregation, by name, the honest clerk who had kept the draft because he had known a day might come when it would matter. She had seen to his future as well. A man who had refused to copy a forgery, and had lost his place for it, would never want for honest work in the valley. Again, the day had come. He had been right. She made certain everyone in the church understood that the proof which broke a duke had been kept alive in a back room off the Avon by a turned-out clerk's plain integrity, and not by any cleverness of her own. The trout still ran dark gold along the flank in the mill leat. Corinne showed her that first married summer, standing at the water's edge where he had fished as a boy. And she stood beside him on the bank that controlled the lead for half the valley. The bank her father had refused 3 times to sell because the cottagers downstream were his people. And she understood at last the whole shape of what had been done and what had been undone, and she was quiet a long while. She did not gloat. There was no one left to gloat over, and it had never been her nature. The Duke had gone abroad, it was said, after the inquiry, to a continent that did not yet know to turn its face from him, and Lilias spared him no more thought than the turning of a page. She had not wanted his ruin. She had wanted her father's name lifted out of the lie, and the orchards returned to the people they fed, and the right to stand in a room and be believed. She had all 3. The wanting of revenge, she found, had quietly let go of her, somewhere on the long road home from the court, and she did not miss it. There was one small thing she kept, and it mattered more than the orchards. On the mantel of the low gray house, where her mother's gray traveling case had been emptied at last of its sewn-in proofs and given back its honest use as a place for letters, Corin set, one evening, the slim, worn volume of Devon songs he had bought in the Bath booksellers, the one with the spray of orchard blossom pressed brown inside it. He had carried it through everything. He opened it to the page where the old blossom lay, and beside it, in the same place he laid a fresh spray, cut that morning from the trees behind the church, white and new against the brown, and he closed the book on the 2 of them together, the season that was lost and the season that had come. Lilias took the book down from the mantel many times in the years that followed. On the gray evenings when the river ran high and the firelight moved on the leather spines, and she opened it to that page, and she looked at the 2 sprays of blossom lying side by side, and she did not need to say anything, and neither did the man who sat across the fire from her with his bad legs stretched toward the warmth. The orchards bore, the valley kept its water, and the bankrupt's daughter, who had walked the length of the Queen's drawing-room alone and turned a duke away before the eyes of the realm, sat in her own house at last in the firelight and was, in the plainest and most complete sense of the word, at home. If Lilias Tregowin's long patience moved you, stay a moment after the fire goes down, and remember the cost of it and the worth of the woman who paid it without once asking to be pitied. She would not have asked. She would only have wanted to be seen. You have seen her. That is enough.